The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless mechanical song as Katie Rodriguez pushed through the employee entrance at Sacred Heart Hospital, the smell of antiseptic hitting her before her shoes touched the linoleum. 5:22 a.m. The ER wouldn't fill with chaos for another 2 hours. She preferred it this way, the corridors still quiet, the monitors clicking their steady rhythm instead of screaming. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation issue, worn soft from 100 washings. The jacket she hung in her locker bore no patches, no insignia, nothing that might invite questions. Her fingers brushed against the lining as she closed the metal door, feeling the raised stitching of the faded trident sewn there months ago, a reminder of who she had been before she became nobody. She had been Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez for 14 years. Now she was just Katie, RN, the quiet woman at the nurse's station who arrived early and left late and never mentioned her past to anyone. The tremor in her hands as she reviewed the morning patient charts wasn't visible to the casual observer, just a slight flutter when she turned pages, a millisecond of hesitation when reaching for her pen. The tremor that came from memory. From the weight of bodies. From the sound of rotor blades cutting through Helmand Province air at 3 a.m. on mission she would never be allowed to discuss. She steadied her hands by gripping the counter. 1 breath. 2. The technique still worked, the same breathing pattern she'd used in breaching operations when her heart rate was 180 and explosions were reshaping the architecture of nearby buildings. Rodriguez. The charge nurse, Margaret, handed her the assignment sheet without looking up from her computer. You're in critical care section today. Rooms 210 through 216. Katie nodded once. She didn't waste words. The other nurses had learned by now that she wasn't unfriendly, just contained. Reserved. Like someone who had lived in a world where every word carried weight and silence carried more. Margaret had stopped trying to make small talk after the second week. The younger nurses sometimes exchanged glances when Katie moved through the ER with that particular kind of purposeful efficiency, the way her hands knew exactly what they were doing before her brain appeared to catch up, muscle memory from 1,000 procedures performed under conditions that would have shattered most people. Room 214 was at the far end of the critical care section, past the isolation units and the crash carts lined up like sentries. Katie checked her tablet as she walked, reviewing the patient file. Marcus Webb, 26 years old, Navy SEAL, training accident 3 weeks prior, thoracic trauma with ongoing recovery complications. Standard post-injury monitoring. The monitor beside his bed displayed a sinus rhythm of 72, blood pressure 118/76. Stable. She pushed open the door. The SEAL lay motionless against white pillows, his left arm outside the blanket, and Katie's breath caught for exactly 1 second before she pulled it back down into her chest where it belonged. The tattoo on his forearm was fresh enough that the lines were still slightly raised. Cade Rodriguez, inked in capital letters, the kind of tattoo men got when they wanted to carry a name with them always. She remembered the day. Remembered the dust and the sound of gunfire and the extraction point and the moment she'd grabbed him under fire and carried him toward the waiting helicopter, his blood soaking through her combat uniform, her hand steady despite the rounds passing close enough that she heard them cutting air. He looked at her when she entered. His eyes were the color of storm-threatened water, and there was absolutely no recognition in them. "Morning, Marcus." Her voice came out level, a professional nurse greeting a patient. Nothing more. Nothing less. "How are you feeling?" "Better." His voice was rough from disuse. "They tell me I was hurt pretty bad." "You were." Katie moved to the 4 line in his right arm, checking the fluid level, the insertion site. Her hands moved with the unconscious precision of someone who had performed this procedure on soldiers in field hospitals, in helicopters, in the backs of moving vehicles while taking fire. The muscle memory took over completely. She didn't have to think about any of it. "You're healing well." "They said I was in Helmand." "I don't remember it." Marcus turned his head toward her, studying her face as if he was trying to read something in her features. "Everyone who visits seems sad about something I can't remember." Katie's jaw tightened for exactly 2 heartbeats. Then she released it. That's normal. Trauma amnesia. It might come back. It might not. Either way, you're recovering. She drew his labs with the smooth efficiency of someone who had threaded needles in darkness, in vehicles bouncing across desert terrain, in caves converted into forward operating bases. The 18-gauge needle slid into his vein without hesitation. The blood flowed dark red into the collection tube. 1 vial. 2. 3. She labeled each one with the steady precision of someone who understood that mistakes in medicine killed people just as efficiently as mistakes in combat. You move like you've done this 1,000 times, Marcus said. I have. Katie finished the last vial and applied pressure to the puncture site, wrapping it with gauze and tape in movements that required no conscious thought. Been nursing for about 8 years. The lie was easy. It wasn't really a lie anyway. She had been practicing medicine for 8 years, just the first 6 of those had been in the field, under fire, with nothing but what she could carry in a rucksack. The last 2 had been here, in a hospital, learning the systems and protocols of civilian medicine, purposefully staying below the threshold where anyone might have reason to investigate her background too closely. The door to room 214 remained open. Katie could hear the ER waking up beyond it, voices, the electronic beep of monitors, the soft thud of the bathroom door in room 212. She finished documenting Marcus's vitals on her tablet and reviewed his medications. The pain regimen was standard. The antibiotics were on schedule. The physical therapy notes indicated he was improving steadily, his range of motion increasing by measurable percentages each day. In another 2 weeks, they'd probably discharge him. She wondered if he would ever remember. She wondered if she wanted him to. The charge nurse's voice crackled over the paging system, Dr. Sterling to the ER, please. Dr. Sterling to the ER. Katie heard the shift in the ambient pressure of the hospital the moment he arrived. Not with any supernatural sensitivity, just the observable change that came when a person carrying particular confidence and authority entered a space. His shoes were expensive, that particular shine that came from either a shine kit or obsessive maintenance. She heard them click against the linoleum from 3 rooms away. She heard them stop at the nurse's station. She heard his voice, pitched just loud enough to carry but not so loud as to seem like he was raising it, which meant it sounded worse somehow, controlled, measured, the tone of someone accustomed to absolute compliance. Patient status reports. Now. Katie continued her work in room 214, but her awareness had bifurcated, a skill developed over years of battlefield awareness, part of her attention fully present with Marcus, checking his catheter, adjusting his blanket, the other part tracking the approaching footsteps with the precision of someone trained to note exits, threats, and positions of potential cover. She had learned long ago that awareness was survival. Even here, in a hospital in Raleigh, in a civilian world where the threats wore different uniforms and carried different weapons, the training didn't switch off. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway of room 214, his frame filling the space, his eyes moving across her with the kind of assessment that took everything in and understood nothing. He was mid-50s, Katie gauged, the kind of handsome that came from good genetics and expensive skin care, his silver hair swept back from a forehead that suggested he'd never spent a day of his life worrying about whether he was competent enough. He watched her work for exactly 4 seconds. "You're the new hire," he said. "Katie Rodriguez, RN." She didn't extend her hand. She kept both hands busy, finishing the adjustment to Marcus's blanket, smoothing it with the same precision she would have used to arrange triage supplies. "From where?" "Texas." "Nursing school, then experience." Vague. Accurate. The kind of answer that invited no follow-up questions because it offered nothing to grab hold of. Dr. Sterling's eyes narrowed slightly. He was used to people filling silences. People who were nervous tended to talk. Katie had learned to let silences stretch like calm water. He looked at Marcus, then back at Katie. "You're assigned to critical care." "Yes, doctor." "Then you should probably know that in this ER, we follow protocol. We don't improvise. We don't take shortcuts." His voice remained perfectly modulated, but there was something underneath it, something that suggested he was testing her, measuring her reaction. We work as a team. A hierarchy. And the hierarchy exists for a reason. Katie met his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to show she was listening, not long enough to show defiance. Understood, Doctor. He held her gaze for 2 seconds longer, as if he was looking for something specific in her face and found instead only the calm neutrality of someone with nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Then he turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, his expensive shoes clicking their rhythm against the tile. That was interesting, Marcus said quietly. Katie didn't respond. She was already moving to the 4 pump, adjusting the infusion rate, checking the medication schedule on her tablet. The seal in the bed with her name tattooed on his arm didn't know that she had carried him across enemy terrain. He didn't know that the hands moving competently through their practice tasks had held him under fire while helicopters descended through mortar fire. He didn't know that she'd walked away from that life because the weight of it had become more than a human spine could carry, even a human spine conditioned by 14 years of military service. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that watching Dr. Sterling turn back to look at her one more time as he reached the nurse's station, his eyes narrowed in calculation, she could see exactly what he was thinking. He was calculating. Measuring. Wondering what her presence meant to the careful architecture of his authority. He was wondering if she was a threat. Dr. Sterling gathered the morning staff at the nurse's station before the shift officially began, his voice carrying across the ER with the practiced authority of someone who'd spent 20 years ensuring everyone understood their place. Katie stood at the far end of the counter, reviewing her patient assignments, but his words found her anyway. "I'm taking bets," Sterling announced, his gaze sweeping the room before landing directly on Katie. "The new girl doesn't last a week. Any takers?" The other nurses turned away simultaneously, suddenly absorbed in their computer screens. One of them, a senior RN named Delores, actually opened a supply cabinet and began reorganizing bandages with theatrical concentration. Nobody met Katie's eyes. The silence was the kind that comes when everyone in a room understands the unspoken rules and has agreed, without words, to enforce them. Katie kept her attention on her patient charts. The papers in her hands felt like armor. She'd learned long ago that attention was a tool. When you didn't give someone your focus, you denied them power. But Sterling wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his cologne arriving before he did, something expensive and aggressive that didn't quite mask the smell of expensive coffee and institutional ego. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" His voice dropped to that particular register designed to carry without shouting, the kind that made everything sound like a stage whisper shared with an audience. "Cat got your tongue, or did they not teach you to speak up at whatever community college you crawled out of?" Katie took one measured breath. The kind she'd learned to take in a bunker in Helmand Province when mortar fire was walking toward her position. Controlled. Measured. The breath of someone whose next decision might matter very much. She looked up at him. Met his eyes directly. "I'm here to work, Doctor," she said evenly. Sterling's smile widened. He saw compliance. What he didn't see was the shift in her posture, barely perceptible, the way her shoulders had straightened just enough to suggest someone who'd given orders to men who carried weapons. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, unbidden and furious with her for its appearance. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand moving with the same precision she'd used to secure and for on a patient in shock. The tear was a mistake. It was supposed to read as weakness. Instead, it read as anger held on the shortest possible leash. "Good," Sterling said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all contained power and suppressed aggression. "Then pick up these charts and learn how real hospitals work before you wash out." He slammed her patient files onto the counter. The impact echoed. Paper scattered across the polished surface like wounded birds, some falling to the floor. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above them. Nobody moved to help. Katie set down her pen. She bent down and retrieved each chart with steady hands, hands that had cleaned up worse messes than this, hands that had held pressure on sucking chest wounds while calling for extraction under fire, hands that had cradled a 19-year-old boy named Marcus Webb while bullets chewed up the dust around them. She arranged the pages in order: Room 214, Room 216, Room 218, ICU consultation pending. Her movements were economical. Necessary. The kind of movements that revealed someone who'd learned that wasted motion was wasted oxygen. Sterling watched her. She could feel the weight of his observation, the way he was trying to measure what he'd just witnessed. He'd expected her to cry harder, to stumble, to apologize for something she hadn't done. By lunch, Sterling's strategy had evolved. He wasn't just testing her anymore. He was building a case. The hospital cafeteria smelled like institutional green beans and the faint ghost of something that might have once been chicken. Katie sat alone at a corner table, away from the clusters of staff who'd learned not to acknowledge her. She'd loaded her tray with the first hot meal she'd allowed herself in days, real food, not vending machine coffee and protein bars, and she ate slowly, a luxury she hadn't permitted herself since arriving at Sacred Heart 6 days ago. Sterling walked past her table. She saw him in her peripheral vision, moving with the casual confidence of someone who owned the space. He slowed as he approached her chair, his trajectory shifting just enough to be plausibly accidental. Just enough that anyone watching might think what happened next was circumstance rather than calculation. He bumped her chair. The tray crashed to the floor. Vegetables scattered across the linoleum like casualties. The green beans rolled in random patterns. The plastic cup of water cracked but held its form, spilling across the tile in a perfect spreading circle. The cafeteria went silent. 50 people suddenly became very interested in their own food, their own conversations, their own ability to disappear. Sterling stood over her, his expression registering mock surprise. "Oh. I'm terribly sorry. These narrow passages." He gestured at the cafeteria, which was actually quite spacious. "So easy to trip." Katie looked up at him from her position on the floor. Her eyes were level. Calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than this, Doctor," she said evenly, her voice steady as bedrock. "A lot bigger." Something flickered across Sterling's face. A moment of uncertainty. But he recovered quickly, the smile returning like a reflex he'd practiced 1,000 times. "I'm sure you have, charity case," he said, his voice carrying across the silent cafeteria. "That's what we're calling you, by the way. Charity case, Katie. Because that's clearly the only reason HR hired you. Affirmative action case. Diversity quota. Probably couldn't pass the actual NCLEX without some kind of accommodation." He walked away. His shoes clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm that sounded like applause for his own wit. Katie got on her hands and knees and picked up every piece of food. The vegetables. The spilled water. The fragments of her pride that she'd decided, long ago, were less valuable than her mission. Nobody offered to help. Nobody pulled her aside to say they thought Sterling was being unfair. Nobody made eye contact when she carried her ruined tray to the trash and walked out of the cafeteria with her uniform still damp from the water. That afternoon, Sterling made his move. He cornered her at the medication room, a narrow space lined with locked cabinets, no witnesses, just Katie and him and the smell of antiseptic that always reminded her of forward operating bases. His voice dropped so only she could hear. "I've been making calls, charity case," he said. His tone was conversational now, almost friendly. "Your references? Your employment history? Nothing checks out. You're a ghost. Which means you're either running from something or you lied on your application. Either way, you're gone." Katie's hand shook as she signed out the medications, epinephrine, morphine, atropine, names that suddenly felt heavier than they should. But her voice remained calm. "My credentials are valid, Doctor. HR verified everything. We'll see about that." Sterling leaned against the cabinet. He looked genuinely pleased with himself. "I called the nursing school in Texas where you claim to have trained. Your name isn't in any of their records. Not the graduation rosters. Not the transcript database. Not anywhere. So either you're lying or you're using a false identity. Either way, that's grounds for immediate termination. It wasn't true. Katie knew it wasn't true. The credentials were solid, established by people who understood how to make things invisible when necessary. But Sterling didn't need it to be true. He just needed to plant doubt in Hour's mind, and doubt was his specialty. He'd been cultivating it since 7 that morning. He'd already contacted what he thought were her references, calls that went nowhere, dead ends that confirmed nothing. He'd already filed vague performance complaints with his board connections, questionable judgment, exhibits unusual behavioral patterns, doesn't follow the hierarchy. He'd already begun reviewing her hiring paperwork with a lawyer's attention to detail, looking for any technicality he could exploit, any missing signature or incomplete form. Katie's hand steadied. She looked at Sterling with the kind of expression someone develops after leading men through ambushes and living to debrief them afterward. "My credentials are valid, Doctor," she repeated, her voice exactly the same as before. "I'm here to do my job." "We'll see," Sterling said again. "We'll definitely see." He left the medication room. Katie finished signing out the medications with a hand that refused to tremble, even though everything inside her was screaming at the implications. She'd built a careful life here, 5 hours from where her sister lived, far enough away that nobody would connect the pieces. A new identity. A quiet job. A place to process the weight of Helmand Province without anyone asking questions. Sterling was dismantling it with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years learning how to weaponize institutional power. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that would matter most. The monitors started singing a different song at hour 3. Katie noticed it first, the subtle shift in Marcus Webb's heart rate climbing from 92 to 103, his blood pressure sliding down like someone slowly releasing the pressure valve on a hydraulic system. She was checking vitals every 10 minutes now, a rhythm that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with pattern recognition honed across 3 tours through Helmand Province. The training accident wound was clean on the surface, but what she saw in the numbers told a story the imaging had missed. Fluid. Building. Pressing. She pulled up his chest X-ray on the monitor, tilted her head the way you do when you're reading something written in a language only your hands remember. The cardiac silhouette was wider than it had been 6 hours ago. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just enough that most nurses would chart it and move on. Katie's lungs moved on. Her hands did not. 105 beats per minute. Blood pressure 98/61 and dropping. The numbers were whispering something that nobody else seemed to hear, a voice like distant artillery fire that gets closer if you're not careful about where you stand. She walked to the nursing station where Dr. Sterling was reviewing charts, his coffee untouched and growing a thin film across the top. 2 other physicians were visible in the distance, Dr. Hayes reviewing lab work at a computer terminal, Dr. Reeves speaking with a pharmaceutical rep near the medication dispensary. The ER had that mid-afternoon weight to it, that specific gravity of controlled chaos that made people lower their voices and move like they'd been rehearsing their exits. Dr. Sterling. Not a question. Not an apology for the interruption. Just a statement, delivered with the flat precision of someone used to command cycles and radio protocols. Room 214 is showing signs of cardiac tamponade. Heart rate climbing, blood pressure destabilizing, widened mediastinum on imaging. He needs intervention in the next 10 to 15 minutes or we're looking at cardiogenic shock. Sterling looked up from his chart. His eyes had that particular texture of a man who'd just been told something he didn't want to believe from someone he didn't want to believe it from. The imaging was normal. 6 hours ago it was normal. Katie held her ground with the stillness of someone who'd learned that movement in a standoff was surrender. The vital signs are trending now. The fluid is building. I can show you the comparison if you want, but his heart rate will keep climbing while we're discussing it. Sterling closed his chart with a deliberate slowness meant to communicate something: contempt, dismissal, superiority, the specific flavor of condescension that tastes like copper. The patient was stabilized. There are no indications for emergency intervention based on his presentation. Based on his vitals. Katie didn't move. His presentation is deteriorating. His blood pressure is 98/60 and falling. That's not a discussion point. That's mathematics. 98 is acceptable. Patients exist with BP in that range for hours. Patients with cardiac tamponade don't. Her voice dropped a note. Still quiet. Still respectful on the surface. But something underneath it had shifted, like the tectonic plates of courtesy had moved a half-inch and exposed something harder beneath. We need to get him to imaging. Stat ultrasound at minimum. He may need emergent drainage. Sterling stood, placed his pen on his desk with the precision of a man laying down a gauntlet. I will not subject a patient to unnecessary intervention based on your interpretation of trending vitals. If his condition changes materially, we'll revisit. Until then, continue standard monitoring. The dismissal was complete. He turned away before Katie had finished processing it, engaging Dr. Hayes in conversation about a completely unrelated case, a deliberate pivot, a wall constructed in real time. Katie stood for one more beat, then walked back to room 214. The monitors were singing louder now. 112 beats per minute. Blood pressure 94/58. Marcus's skin was taking on that particular sheen, that fine sheen of someone whose body was beginning its slow migration away from adequate perfusion. His breathing was shallow, faster, the kind of compensatory tachypnea that meant his body was already starting to panic on a cellular level. Katie pulled up his chart, documented the vital signs, added a clinical note, recommend stat ultrasound and consideration of emergent pericardiocentesis for suspected cardiac tamponade secondary to training wound. Patient trending toward decompensation. She sent it to Sterling, copied both Dr. Hayes and Dr. Reeves. 30 seconds later, her phone buzzed. A text message from Hayes, can't assess from chart notes. Need clinical evil by attending. 2 minutes after that, Sterling's response, patient stable per attending assessment. Continue supportive care. The response wasn't a decision. It was a wall. It was the sound of a doctor protecting his authority more than his patient, a hierarchy being defended against a threat, wearing scrubs and carrying a faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, a patch with insignia that Dr. Sterling would never understand and wouldn't care to understand. At hour 3 and 22 minutes, Marcus's blood pressure hit 90/54. Katie was with him when it happened. She was checking his pupils, assessing his mental status, and his eyes had that glazed quality, that look of someone whose brain was beginning to experience inadequate oxygen perfusion. His skin was cool now, damp. The monitors showed heart rate climbing to 118, and his breathing had that specific rhythm of compensation, shallow, rapid, the cadence of a body that knew it was in trouble even if the doctors didn't believe it. She walked to the medication dispensary and pulled up his chart on the computer, standing there for 1 beat, 2 beats, processing the mathematics of what was about to happen. Pericardiocentesis. Emergency needle aspiration of pericardial fluid. It was outside her scope. She knew this the way you know the color of your own hands. In most states, in most hospitals, the procedure belonged to physicians. It required a license with an MD at the end of it, a credential that Katie possessed only in the form of training she'd received in the Helmand province, in forward operating bases where protocol meant something different than it did in civilian medicine. But Marcus was going into cardiac arrest, and Dr. Sterling was somewhere in the hospital discussing insurance liability with people who didn't understand that patients die when you prioritize paperwork over pulse. The cold clarity came over her the same way it had in 2009 when mortar fire was falling and she had 14 wounded SEALs and 1 helicopter inbound and no time for anything except the decision that would keep them alive. Her breathing slowed. Her hands stopped trembling. The entire world narrowed to a single patient and the exact procedure that might save him. She walked back to room 214. Dr. Sterling was standing in the hallway speaking with the hospital attorney, a woman whose name badge read Sarah Mendez and whose expression suggested she'd much rather be anywhere else. Both of them turned when they heard Katie's footsteps. He's deteriorating. Katie's voice was level as surgery. His blood pressure is dropping. He's not maintaining perfusion. He needs intervention now or he arrests in the next 5 minutes. I've reviewed his assessment. Sterling's voice had that particular edge, that specific sharpness of a man whose authority had just been questioned in front of an attorney. He's stable. He's not stable. He's compensating. There's a difference. And you have a medical degree from where, exactly? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone has just made a tactical error. Katie's eyes met his for the first time since the morning, and in that space between blinks, something shifted. The fear, his fear, not hers, became visible. He could see it. He could feel it. He couldn't name it or explain it, but he understood that he'd just said something to someone who knew exactly how bad this situation was about to become. "Step aside, doctor." Katie said it the way you give commands in a combat zone. That's not a suggestion. That's not a request. Security. Sterling's voice jumped an octave. I need security in the ER now. Katie was already moving. She walked past him into room 214, closed the door, locked it from the inside. Through the window, she saw the security guards, 2 of them, probably in their 50s, neither of them trained for anything beyond checking badges and escorting people to the parking lot. They were running, though. Sterling was pointing. Shouting. She had minutes. Maybe seconds. Marcus's heart rate was 123 now, his blood pressure 84/42. His eyes were fluttering, consciousness beginning its migration away from the surface. The monitors showed the familiar pattern of a heart that was being crushed, literally crushed, by fluid building up in the space around it. With each beat, his heart had less room to expand. With each cycle, his cardiac output was dropping incrementally, the equations of physics becoming the equations of death. Katie prepped the ultrasound machine with hands that remembered 1,000 battlefield procedures. She found his subxiphoid area, identified the echo-free space, the fluid accumulation, dark and sinister against the grey background of muscle and bone. The needle entry point was clear in her mind before her hands moved. She anesthetized the area with 1% lidocaine, marked her entry, set up the pericardiocentesis kit with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this exact procedure in worse light, worse conditions, worse circumstances than a modern hospital could manufacture. Security was pounding on the door. Open up. Now. Sterling's voice was underneath it, high and strained, that nurse is practicing outside her scope. She's committing a felony. Document everything. Katie advanced the needle with millimeter precision beneath the xiphoid process, angled toward the left shoulder, guided by ultrasound and by muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought. The needle penetrated the pericardial sac. She felt the subtle give as it breached the tissue, the sense of resistance disappearing. She began drawing fluid. 50 cc pale yellow, amber at the edges. Blood-tinged. Exactly what cardiac tamponade should look like. 75 cc. 100 cc. Marcus's heart rate was dropping. 105. 98. 92. His blood pressure was climbing. 92/50. 98/55. 102/60. The mathematics of the body reasserting themselves, the pressure easing, the space around his heart expanding, the physics of the situation shifting back toward survivable. The door burst open. Sterling entered with 2 board members, a woman Katie didn't recognize and a man wearing the specific posture of someone who'd spent 40 years making decisions about other people, followed by a hospital attorney with a briefcase and 4 security guards who looked profoundly confused about whether they were supposed to stop a nurse or support a doctor. Step away from that patient immediately. Sterling's voice was shaking. His hands were shaking. The entire edifice of his authority was shaking because he'd just watched a nurse perform an emergency procedure that he'd told her not to perform, and now he was going to have to explain to a hospital attorney why he'd prevented proper medical care. Katie withdrew the needle with unhurried, methodical precision. She applied pressure to the entry site, held it for 90 seconds, then applied a sterile bandage. She hung the pericardial fluid for lab analysis, documented the volume in the chart, 115 cc total, checked Marcus's vitals one final time. Heart rate 88. Blood pressure 104/62. Oxygen saturation 98%. Sinus rhythm. The monitor's singing a different song now. Stable. Alive. Recovering. She turned to face Sterling, and every person in the room felt it, the specific shift that happens when someone stops hiding and starts being seen. Her shoulders squared. Her voice deepened a register. The timid nurse who'd picked up his chart pages from the floor that morning was gone, replaced by the presence of someone who'd spent her life making decisions when lives depended on it. The patient is stable. Cardiac tamponade resolved. She paused, let that sit for one beat. He would have died in the next 10 minutes. You can discuss liability and scope of practice with his family during his funeral, or you can thank me and update your protocols. Either way, he's breathing. The hospital attorney stepped forward, but before she could speak, Katie continued, her voice steady as surgical steel. I'm going on break. The space between heartbeats was where Katie made her decision. One beat, Marcus's oxygen saturation at 63. 2 beats, the cardiac monitor flatlined into a single deadly line. 3 beats, Dr. Sterling's voice still echoing across the nurse's station, not your patient, not your problem. Katie moved. Not around Sterling. Through him. Her shoulder caught his arm as she passed, a contact so small it might have been accidental, and she walked into room 214 without asking permission, without waiting for authorization that would never come. The fluorescent lights above Marcus's bed flickered like they were struggling to stay conscious. His skin had taken on the color of old paper, translucent and gray, and his breathing had become the shallow gasps of someone drowning in air. The monitor showed chaos, rhythm strips that looked like someone had dragged a pencil across jagged glass. Katie didn't hesitate. Her hands moved on their own, the kind of muscle memory that lives in bone and nerve and muscle fiber, deeper than thought. She opened the crash cart without looking, her fingers finding the exact drawer in the darkness, the way a pianist finds the right key without reading the staff. Sterile gloves snapped like gunshots. She ran an alcohol prep across the skin at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her touch so practiced it was almost gentle. The needle was 14 gauge, long enough to reach through chest wall and ribs and the fibrous sac that had filled with fluid, blood that should have been moving through veins, now compressing Marcus's heart like a hand slowly closing around it. Her other hand found the ultrasound wand, and she positioned it with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times under far worse circumstances. Not in a hospital. In a forward operating base in Helmand Province, by the light of a headlamp and the sound of incoming fire. In a convoy vehicle that had 3 minutes before the next IED struck. In the dust and blood and screaming that never really leaves your body. The needle entered. No resistance, no hesitation. She felt the subtle pop of the pericardium giving way, and then the syringe began to fill with dark fluid, not the bright red of fresh arterial blood, but the brownish stain of days-old bleeding, fluid that had been stealing Marcus's life 1 milliliter at a time. The hiss of air escaping as she drew back the plunger. That sound. That small, perfect sound that meant pressure was releasing, that meant a heart could expand again, that meant one more person wasn't going to die on her watch. She watched the monitor as she withdrew the fluid. 60 milliliters. 80. 100. The oxygen saturation climbed. 63. 70. 78. 84. The rhythm began to organize itself, the jagged line smoothing into something that resembled a heartbeat again, not perfect, but alive. The monitor began to beep in rhythm, a mechanical pulse that meant survival. Katie placed a sterile dressing over the needle site and stepped back, her breathing still controlled, her hand steady as bedrock. The room had gone absolutely silent. Even the other nurses, the ones who had been trained to challenge her, to doubt her, to whisper that she didn't belong here, they stood frozen. Dr. Sterling had appeared in the doorway, his face the color of storm clouds, his mouth opening to speak, but whatever he was about to say died somewhere in his throat because Marcus's oxygen sat was 91 now, holding. Climbing. The monitor showed a rate of 98 beats per minute. A sinus rhythm. Not elegant, not perfect, but unmistakably, undeniably alive. "I need someone to call cardiology," Katie said, her voice level as still water. "Tell them we have a post-procedure tamponade patient requiring ICU transfer. And get me 2 liters of normal saline running, he's going to need volume." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped an octave. "Now." That wasn't a request. A nurse moved. Then another. The orders were already being called in, the ICU bed was already being prepared, and Katie pulled a chair to the side of Marcus's bed and sat down. She didn't look at Dr. Sterling. She didn't acknowledge the board members who were already beginning to whisper in the hallway. She simply placed her hand on Marcus's forehead and felt for fever, then checked his pupils, then began the systematic assessment of a human being who was still here, still breathing, still fighting. His pulse under her fingertips was quick but strong. The skin around his fingernails was returning to normal color. Pain was information, and right now the information was telling her that this young SEAL had a chance. Hour 2, Katie adjusted the morphine drip by 0.2 milliliters. The patient needed pain control without respiratory depression, a conversation her hands had with the medication as precisely as a musician adjusts a string. Hour 4, a small bleed began at the pericardiocentesis site. Katie caught it before the monitor even registered the change in vital signs, before the alarm sounded, before anyone else would have noticed. She applied pressure with sterile gauze, her touch somehow both gentle and absolute, and the bleeding slowed. She held it there, not moving, watching Marcus's oxygen saturation, watching his heart rate, watching the way his body was responding to the medication and the fluids and the simple act of being cared for by someone who understood that his life was the only thing that mattered in the universe. When the bleed stopped, she applied a new dressing and sat back down. Hour 6, Dr. Sterling appeared with the medical director and a hospital attorney. His voice was sharp, professional, the voice of a man who believed he had already won. "She's practicing beyond her scope. That procedure requires physician authorization. I'm ordering her immediate removal from this patient's care." Katie didn't look up from adjusting Marcus's for fluids. "Put it in writing." The medical director blinked. "Excuse me." "Put the order in writing," Katie said, her eyes still on the drip rate, on the volume that needed to flow through Marcus's veins to replace what he'd lost. "If you're removing me as his primary nurse and accepting responsibility for his care, document it. Sign it. I want it on record." She finally looked up, and the room seemed to shift. Her eyes were flat, empty of anything remotely resembling negotiation. "What's the problem, doctor? Don't want to put your name on the order." The medical director's face reddened, but he said nothing. He turned and walked out. Hour 8, Sterling returned with termination paperwork. The attorney handed it to Katie with an expression of satisfaction. "Effective immediately. You're terminated for practicing beyond your scope of practice. Security will escort you out." Katie took the papers without reading them. She signed her name with a pen she found on the bedside table, her handwriting steady and precise. Then she handed the papers back and returned to adjusting Marcus's medications, to reading the monitor, to checking his pupils, to living in the space where his survival depended on her presence and the absolute refusal to leave. "This is trespassing now," the attorney said, her voice carrying an edge of triumph. "Then call the police," Katie said quietly. She dipped a fresh cloth in cool water and placed it on Marcus's forehead, and that was the end of that conversation. Hour 10, Sterling appeared again, this time with what he clearly believed was devastating information. He announced loudly enough for every nurse within 30 feet to hear that Katie Rodriguez's employment history was a dead end. No background beyond 6 months. No verifiable references. Just a social security number and a nursing license that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. He seemed to expect this revelation to land like a grenade, to shame her into leaving, to break her somehow. Katie listened without turning from Marcus's bedside. When he finished, she said only, "The licensing board verified my credentials. They confirmed I'm qualified. That's all that matters." She adjusted the oxygen flow by 0.1 liters per minute and went back to her patient. Hour 12, a small bleed began again at the pericardiocentesis site. Katie caught it again. The cardiologist who finally arrived to assess Marcus stood in the doorway and watched her work, watched her hands move with the certainty of someone who had done this 1,000 times, who had performed this kind of medicine in places where mistakes meant death before the helicopter could arrive. When the bleeding stopped, he said quietly that intervention saved his life. But it was illegal. "He's alive," Katie said. That was the only law that mattered. Hour 14, Marcus's oxygen saturation held steady at 94. His heart rate was stable at 86. The monitor showed a clean, organized rhythm. The fluid in his chest cavity had been drained. His blood pressure, which had been collapsing, had returned to 104/62. He was going to make it. Hour 16, the ICU called. They were ready. Marcus was stable enough to transfer. Katie helped move him onto the stretcher, her movements efficient and careful, supporting his chest as they transferred him, whispering something to him that only he could hear. She rode the elevator with him in silence, watched as the ICU nurses took over his care, confirmed their orders, and then she walked out of his room and back down to the nurses' station where Dr. Sterling stood waiting with security. "Escort her out," Sterling said. "Make sure she takes nothing." Katie walked to her locker in the break room, the one with the small dent in the corner and the lock that stuck slightly. Inside was a cracked mug, the one Jasmine had given her on her first day, painted with terrible flowers and the words "Kill a Nurse." There was a dying succulent on the middle shelf, brown at the edges but still breathing. And there was the photograph. 14 faces in desert camouflage, smiling at the camera, 2 rows of young operators who had believed they were invincible. Half of them weren't smiling anymore. Half of them weren't anywhere. She packed these things into a cardboard box, watching as the security guard watched her, as if she might steal hospital property, as if anything in this building mattered more than getting them back outside. The rain had started again. Cold rain, the kind that fell on Raleigh in early spring and felt like punishment. Katie stood at the bus stop with her cardboard box and watched the rain darken the cardboard, watched it begin to dissolve. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. Not from shame. From the profound exhaustion of 16 hours spent holding a human being back from the edge of death, from the knowledge that she had done the right thing and was being punished for it, from the weight of keeping all those secrets, from the understanding that the one quiet place she had found to heal was now closed to her. The PTSD that she had learned to manage in the routines of the hospital, in the small tasks that gave her purpose, in the patients who needed her skills, in the work that proved she was still useful, was rising again like dark water. She sat down on the bench and allowed herself to cry for the first time since Helmand Province, tears mixing with rain until she couldn't tell where the sky ended and her face began. The cardboard box grew soggy in the rain. Katie sat on the bus bench outside Sacred Heart, her hands shaking as the water soaked through to the cracked mug inside, the one with the faded saying "Rough Day." Mine too, and the dying succulent that would be dead by morning. The photo of her SEAL team stared up at her from the bottom, half the faces gone now, their names still clear in her memory even if the world had decided she was nobody. A nurse. Just a nurse. That's what she'd been for 6 months. 6 months of silence. 6 months of building something that wasn't a weapon. And it had taken 16 hours to destroy it. The rain hammered the pavement like artillery. She didn't move. She sat there watching the water stream across the parking lot, watching it carry away something she couldn't name but felt like drowning. The PTSD that she'd learned to manage in the routines of the hospital, the small tasks that gave her purpose, the patients who needed her skills, the work that proved she was still useful, was rising again like dark water rising behind a broken dam. She'd spent 16 hours at Marcus's bedside because he was hers to save. That was the only language she understood. That was the code. But the code didn't translate in civilian hospitals. In civilian hospitals, protocols mattered more than lives. Hierarchy mattered more than competence. And men like Sterling protected their own at any cost. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just sat there, soaking wet, with everything she'd rebuilt crumbling in cardboard at her feet. What happened next didn't make the evening news. It made the hospital board meeting at 3:15 a.m. The IT director's name was Holloway. Katie had seen him in passing, Marine tattoo on his neck, that unmistakable bearing that came from having worn the uniform. They'd never spoken, but something in his eyes when he passed her in the hallway suggested he knew exactly what she was. At 2:53 a.m., less than 3 hours after Katie walked out of Sacred Heart in the rain, Dr. Sterling made a decision that would unravel everything he'd built over 20 years. He accessed the security system using his administrative credentials. He pulled up the ER camera footage from room 214. And he attempted to delete the video of Katie performing the pericardiocentesis, the 37 seconds that showed her hand steady as surgical lasers, the fluid hissing out of the needle, Marcus's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 92, the entire crisis compressed into half a minute of pure medical competence that contradicted everything Sterling had spent months proving about her. Holloway was reviewing backup protocols when the deletion flag appeared on his screen. The system had 2 layers of security. The first was automatic backup to an off-site server at 2:48 a.m., 1 minute after Sterling initiated deletion. The second was the alert that went directly to Holloway's encrypted phone. A Marine doesn't ignore alerts from a hospital security system. He pulled the footage. He reviewed it twice. Then he called the hospital's legal team and waited until dawn. Katie was collecting her final paycheck from HR when the lockdown announcement crackled through the intercom. Federal custody transport. Critical patient. East entrance sealed. No exceptions. She stood in the hallway holding an envelope with what amounted to severance, 2 weeks' pay for 16 hours of medicine, when the commotion began. Shouting in Pashto. Boots moving at a run. A stretcher wheeled past with a man handcuffed to the rails, his face twisted with something between rage and terror, his eyes scanning the corridor as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. Then his eyes found hers. The screaming stopped. The man's body went rigid, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the translator step forward, his face pale. That is her. That is her. The shadow. The shadow of Helmand Province. I have seen, he was cut off by the federal handler moving him toward the secure trauma bay, but those words hung in the air like smoke. The shadow. A name she'd earned on a hillside in Sanjin Valley where she'd held a 23-year-old Marine's femoral artery together with gauze and hands that wouldn't tremble, moving through that night like something neither alive nor dead, something that existed only to complete the mission. The SEAL team leader stepped forward before Katie could move. He was tall, built like oak, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him stood an FBI handler with a tablet and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. The SEAL team leader's voice cut through the silence like a knife through silk. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. United States Navy SEAL. He said it like a pronouncement. Like salvation and reckoning all at once. 2 bronze stars. Purple Heart. Navy Cross for actions in Helmand Province. He paused between each medal, giving the hospital staff time to understand the weight of what they were hearing. You carried Marcus Webb to the extraction point under sustained enemy fire while bleeding out from a shrapnel wound to the femoral artery. 2 of your teammates didn't make it out. He looked around the ER. She saved 14 SEALs that day. 14 men who went home to their families because this woman refused to quit. The FBI handler stepped forward. Senior Chief Rodriguez's combat missions remain classified. But this detainee's identification confirms she was the primary target of a 2-year enemy assassination campaign by Taliban forces in Helmand Province. They called her the Shadow because she moved through darkness and nobody came back alive if she was hunting them. He looked at Katie with something like respect. You've been under an active protection protocol since your discharge. Your employment records were intentionally sparse as a security measure. The room wasn't breathing anymore. It was just holding its breath like a patient waiting for diagnosis. Then Dr. Sterling's face went white. Not red. Not defensive. White. The kind of white that comes when a man realizes his entire position was built on quicksand and the ground has already started to open up beneath him. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His carefully constructed network was already crumbling in real time. The board members he'd called in favors from were suddenly discovering urgent appointments. The outside risk management consultant had already left the building. The references he'd tried to contact in Texas turned out to be Naval Special Warfare Command screening numbers, and that meant his calls had triggered federal alerts. That meant he was already on a list. Holloway stepped forward with the hard drive. Dr. Sterling, at 2:33 a.m. this morning you accessed the security system and attempted to delete footage from the ER cameras covering room 214. Sterling's voice cracked like ice. I don't know what you're talking about. Every frame was automatically backed up to our off-site server, Holloway continued, and his voice carried the absolute flatness of someone delivering a court-martial verdict. Your deletion attempt was flagged and reported to the board of directors at 3:15 a.m. I reviewed the footage myself. It shows Senior Chief Rodriguez performing a textbook pericardiocentesis that saved a patient's life while multiple physicians, including you, refused to treat him. The hospital's medical director stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. Dr. Sterling, you're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you out. But Sterling wasn't finished. Not yet. His mouth worked like a man drowning. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know she was military? Katie spoke for the first time since the reveal, her voice quiet and steady. I never lied, Doctor. I just didn't tell you who I was. There's a difference. 2 nurses Katie had worked with, young women who'd turned away during the humiliation, stepped forward. He's been doing this for years, one of them said. Running people out. Anyone who threatens his authority. He told me to stay away from Katie or he'd tank my performance review. The other nurse nodded, her hands trembling. I'm sorry. I should have said something. The second nurse's voice broke slightly, but she held firm. We all should have. The medical director returned with hospital security. Dr. Sterling, your privileges at Sacred Heart are permanently revoked. You are terminated for cause. Attempted evidence destruction. Premeditated filing of false complaints. The board has voted unanimously. Sterling walked toward the exit like a man moving through water, his network of allies having evaporated the moment power left his hands. The FBI handler was already on his phone, his voice clipped and professional. We'll need a full statement from Senior Chief Rodriguez regarding the detainee's identification. This may provide intelligence value. Holloway met Katie's eyes. Something passed between them, the recognition of veterans who understood what it meant to carry secrets and live quietly until the moment came to stand up. 6 months later, Katie adjusted the nameplate on her desk, Katie Rodriguez, Director of Emergency Medicine, Sacred Heart Hospital. The office overlooked the ER floor where she'd once worked in silence, absorbing humiliation with a composure that came from having survived worse. On the desk sat a photo in dress blues, Katie shaking hands with Marcus Webb, fully recovered, his arm still bearing her name tattooed into his skin. Marcus had returned to active duty. The Taliban detainees' intelligence had led to the dismantling of 3 cells in Helmand province. Katie's PTSD hadn't disappeared, but working openly, training nurses in combat casualty care protocols, mentoring veterans transitioning to civilian medicine, it gave her purpose beyond hiding. She walked down to the ER floor for morning rounds, her jacket hanging open, the faded unit patch with its trident insignia visible for anyone to see. Room 214 held a new patient now, recovering from a car accident. The attending physician saw Katie and immediately stepped aside. What do you think, Director? She reviewed the chart with the same steady hands, the same quiet competence. She provided her assessment, clear, authoritative, inarguable. The physician nodded and implemented her recommendations without question. This was what real authority looked like. not built on humiliation and hierarchy, but earned through competence and courage. Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification courses at Raleigh Community College for minimum wage. His medical license remained restricted. His network had vanished the moment power left his hands. Katie returned to her office as the sun rose over Raleigh, casting golden light across the ER where she'd once worked in shadows. She touched the unit patch through the fabric of her jacket, remembering Helm and Province, remembering the 14 SEALs who made it home because she refused to quit. The trembling in her hands had finally stopped. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you could do, please like and subscribe. Comment below, have you ever been judged only to prove someone dead wrong? Let's hear your story.